In a sharp escalation of diplomatic friction, Iran on Sunday condemned as unjustifiable the reinstatement of United Nations sanctions over its nuclear program, reacting strongly after talks with Western powers collapsed despite last-minute mediation efforts by China and Russia. The announcement came just hours after the UN measures officially took effect overnight, reviving punitive restrictions that had been dormant since the 2015 nuclear accord. The revived sanctions bar countries, companies and individuals worldwide from any dealings linked to Iran's nuclear and ballistic missile activities. The sanctions were reimposed following the failure of weeks of intense negotiations aimed at reviving the nuclear deal, officially known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA. According to diplomats familiar with the discussions, Western powers triggered the so-called snapback mechanism, a provision in the 2015 accord that allows parties to restore sanctions if Iran is judged to be in breach of its commitments. Efforts to prevent this outcome came down to the wire. Chinese and Russian envoys reportedly pushed hard for a delay in the snapback process, hoping to buy more time for talks. Those efforts ultimately fell short, leading to the abrupt collapse of negotiations and the automatic reactivation of sanctions. In Tehran, senior officials expressed outrage over the decision. A spokesperson for Iran's foreign ministry denounced the sanctions as unjustifiable, insisting that the move undermines what little trust remained between Iran and the Western powers. The official stressed that Iran viewed the sanctions as a political maneuver rather than a legitimate response to any wrongdoing. The international community must recognize that this step jeopardizes prospects for diplomacy and further destabilizes the region, the spokesperson said in remarks carried by state media. The ministry also accused the United States and its allies of acting in bad faith, pointing to recent Israeli and American strikes on Iranian nuclear sites. Tehran has long maintained that its nuclear program is for peaceful purposes, while Western powers and Israel allege it is a cover for developing weapons capability. The return of sanctions came just days after reports emerged of coordinated Israeli and US strikes on several Iranian nuclear facilities. These attacks, which Tehran has condemned as acts of aggression, were cited by Iranian officials as evidence that Western powers were not committed to a diplomatic resolution. Iranian state television described the strikes as an attempt to cripple its peaceful nuclear research program and claimed that critical infrastructure had suffered serious damage. Western officials, however, defended the actions as necessary to limit Iran's capacity to produce weapons-grade material. The reimposition of sanctions and the accompanying military actions have heightened fears of renewed conflict in the Middle East. Analysts say the situation threatens to further destabilize a region already grappling with ongoing crises in Gaza, Lebanon, and the Red Sea shipping lanes. According to regional security experts, the snapback sanctions not only isolate Iran economically, but also send a strong signal of international resolve. However, they warn that such measures may backfire by strengthening hardline factions in Tehran who oppose any engagement with the West. The JCPOA, signed in 2015 between Iran and 6 world powers, the US, UK, France, Germany, Russia and China, was hailed at the time as a breakthrough in curbing Iran's nuclear ambitions in exchange for sanctions relief. That arrangement began to unravel in 2018, when then US President Donald Trump withdrew Washington from the deal and reimposed unilateral sanctions. Since then, attempts by subsequent US and European administrations to revive the agreement have repeatedly stalled over disputes about compliance, sequencing of sanctions relief, and the scope of Iran's nuclear activities. Tehran insists that it has complied with the spirit of the agreement and blames Western powers for failing to uphold their commitments. Iranian officials argue that new sanctions will not force them back to the table, but will instead harden their stance. The foreign ministry declared that the country would continue to pursue its legitimate right to develop peaceful nuclear technology, despite what it described as unjust external pressure. Beijing and Moscow, both signatories to the original deal, voiced disappointment at the failure to avert the sanctions. Chinese officials reiterated their call for restraint and dialogue, warning that the current path risks triggering a dangerous spiral of confrontation. Russia's foreign ministry similarly criticized the snapback decision, claiming it reflected Western unwillingness to compromise. Both countries are expected to maintain trade ties with Iran, though they face potential penalties under the renewed sanctions regime. On the other hand, Western capitals framed the move as a necessary response to Iran's alleged violations. A European Union diplomat was quoted as saying that Iran's continued enrichment of uranium beyond agreed limits left us with no choice. For Israel, the reimposed sanctions were welcomed as an overdue step. Israeli officials have long argued that Iran's nuclear activities pose an existential threat and that only strong economic and military pressure can deter Tehran's ambitions. Although Israel has not officially confirmed the recent strikes on Iranian sites, senior figures in its defense establishment have hinted at a willingness to take unilateral action to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons capability. Analysts note that the combination of international sanctions and targeted military actions reflects a strategy of maximum pressure designed to weaken Iran's ability to advance its program while compelling it to return to the negotiating table. The renewed restrictions are expected to hit Iran's already struggling economy hard. The sanctions target key sectors including oil exports, banking, and the procurement of dual-use technologies that could aid missile development. Economists predict that the snapback will exacerbate inflation, restrict access to foreign investment, and worsen the daily hardships faced by ordinary Iranians. In previous rounds of sanctions, the Iranian currency lost much of its value and unemployment soared. Local media in Tehran carried reports of growing public frustration, with some business leaders warning that renewed international isolation will stifle opportunities for growth and innovation. Legal experts have raised questions about the legitimacy of the snapback mechanism's use in this instance, particularly given that the US withdrew from the original nuclear deal in 2018. Critics argue that Washington forfeited its right to trigger the clause by leaving the agreement. Supporters counter that the mechanism is embedded in the original UN Security Council resolution that endorsed the deal and thus remains valid regardless of individual parties' participation. The debate underscores the broader challenge of sustaining multilateral agreements in a shifting geopolitical landscape. International aid organizations have warned that renewed sanctions could worsen humanitarian conditions in Iran by limiting access to medical supplies and critical goods. Although the sanctions formally exempt humanitarian trade, past experience shows that many companies and banks avoid transactions with Iran altogether for fear of penalties, leading to shortages of essential items. Human rights advocates have urged the UN and Western governments to ensure that measures aimed at restricting nuclear and military activities do not unduly harm civilians. Diplomats say there is still a narrow window for renewed talks, but acknowledge that the atmosphere is increasingly hostile. Trust between Iran and the Western powers is at a low ebb, and regional actors are bracing for potential escalations. The situation remains fluid, with observers warning that further military strikes or retaliatory actions by Iran could ignite a broader conflict. Amid the unfolding crisis, Tehran's clearest message remains its official condemnation. Iran on Sunday condemned as unjustifiable the reinstatement of United Nations sanctions over its nuclear program after the collapse of talks with Western powers, despite last-ditch effort by China and Russia to secure a delay, and Israeli and US strikes on its nuclear sites. This statement, carried by Iranian state media, captures both the sense of grievance and defiance that now defines the country's stance. The reinstatement of UN sanctions marks a new and potentially volatile phase in the long-running dispute over Iran's nuclear ambitions. What began as a hopeful experiment in multilateral diplomacy a decade ago has once again devolved into a cycle of pressure and resistance, with the stakes for regional and global security as high as ever.